welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you can join us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 115, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Christopher Davis. He's the Chief Medical Officer for Liquivida. They are a nutrient IV company. And this conversation is going to be around just that, nutrient IV therapy. And you'd almost have to be living under a rock nowadays to have not seen the proliferation of the nutrient IV space. And so this is a conversation that is going to dive into a little bit of an understanding of nutrient IV therapy, who it's appropriate for, who we should be cautious with nutrient IV therapy with, and then I think most importantly, kind of how you should think about approaching this as an exercise professional. What you're going to hear in this conversation with Dr. Davis is that there's still a lot of emerging science that's really getting out there on this, a lot of emerging, regulation and standards, but it's here and people are using it. And those of us that are working with patients or clients need to be informed on this topic. And that's exactly what this podcast is designed to do, is inform you on this topic. Now, I will say that some of this could potentially get a little bit into you moving out of your scope of practice. So as we'll talk about in the episode, partnering with a functional medicine physician, partnering with a registered dietitian or other medical professional that may understand this a little bit better would likely be a safe way to protect yourself, as well as provide your patient or client with the information they need to make an informed decision as to if this is something that they want to engage with. So there definitely is a lot of considerations around this. This episode is really designed to be an informational starting point for those of you that are curious about nutrient IV therapy. Any information we'd like to share with you from the episode can be found at the show notes page. That's by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 115. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Christopher Davis. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Christopher Davis. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So happy to be here.
So I have all kinds of jealousy with Dr. Davis. We were just talking before we got in the air. He's down in Sarasota, Florida, where it's nice and warm and not the cold, frigid weather of Michigan. So we appreciate you maybe sending some warmth our way if you could possibly do that.
Yeah, warm thoughts coming your way. I'm sending love and warm thoughts your way.
Unfortunately, this discussion is not going to be around warmth. It's going to be around nutrient IV therapy. And as I was saying to Dr. Davis before we got in the air, this is a topic that I'm very interested in discussing, in part just for my own knowledge, but also in part because we've not covered it in the podcast before. And it's an area that's really proliferating very quickly. So we're going to talk about a lot in this conversation. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, can you give us a little bit of an idea of your background just to provide some context for the discussion?
Sure. I am a board certified interventional cardiologist by training. Been practicing cardiology since 2005, so 2004, so almost 19, 20 years. About 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to practice medicine a little bit differently and doing more of a functional medicine approach, more integrative medicine approach, and more looking at root causes of illness, and particularly in heart disease, approaching people from looking at underlying root causes of their problems, atrial fibrillation, their heart, their blockages in their arteries. And in the midst of doing that, what I've found is, I still practice a lot of cardiology, but I see lots of everything, things from, mold and Lyme to people with all kinds of other chronic illnesses as well. I got involved with a IV nutrient therapy company called Liquivida. And after that was my first step into kind of bringing another source of a different approach to medicine into my cardiology practice. So I brought a Liquivida into my cardiology practice. And from that point on, I just continued to expand on the functional medicine realm. And then I became the chief medical officer of Liquivida. So I'm a cardiologist that does a little bit, people like to call me a unicorn cardiologist.
Yeah, I would say so. I've worked with interventional cardiologist before, and you've definitely gone down a different path.
Yeah, yeah. It's been exciting. I mean, every day now it's really exciting. Some of the stuff we're working on, really a lot of neurocognitive stuff we're working on. When we talk about kind of performance enhancement stuff, my newest saying and what I base my practice on in general is like I think we get sick and old because of a lot of the toxins we're exposed to, right? And we can measure mitochondrial function and oxidative stress. And so for me now, my passion is really kind of addressing those things and making sure everybody is optimized from the perspective of kind of a lot of times we can't avoid those things in our environment because they're just there. And so it's about knowing how to deal with those things. And IV nutrient therapy is a great part of kind of how to optimize our body so that we can deal with all those stressors that we're exposed to.
Great. You said a couple things in there that may generate a separate podcast request at another time, but we're going to try to keep this conversation focused on nutrient IV therapy. And although those words sound pretty self-explanatory, I think we need to just start right there. What would be your definition of nutrient IV therapy, just so we're all on the same page?
Right, right. So nutrient IV therapy is administering vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and even fatty acids via the intravenous route. So into the veins, and what ends up happening is you achieve concentrations of these nutrients that are far greater than you could achieve by absorbing them through normal kind of oral intake. Thus, these nutrients get into the cell better. And so, one of the things that I think is important to realize is that when we eat whatever we're eating, our foods that have the B vitamins in it, for example, when we absorb these things, they get into our bloodstream, but not always do they get intracellular because our cells are plagued with, again, some of the things I just talked about, all the toxins, they change the cell membrane structure. So that a lot of times the nutrients that we are, even if we're absorbing them from our gut, we may not be getting them intracellularly where they need to be to carry out all the processes and the cofactors that they are. So IV nutrient therapy is giving those minerals, vitamins, amino acids in an intravenous format so that they bypass the gut for absorption.
Got it. Got it. And by bypassing the gut for absorption, that degrades them less in the harsh environment of digestion, which allows them to be more bioavailable at the cellular level. Is that essentially it?
So bioavailable at the cellular. So part of it is, with if we were to look at the number of people who have malabsorption issues these days, I'm sure you guys have heard of the concept of leaky gut
Yep.
or intestinal permeability. I mean, that's rampant these days. I mean, I would say more people have it than don't have it. So when it comes to effectively absorbing nutrients, that's one thing that we are, as time goes on, we don't do. I mean, most people are not absorbing those nutrients as well as they should. The other part of this is let's think about our food source in general. The nutrients in our food sources, the nutrients in the soil are the food of today. We say this all the time. It's not the food of 50 years ago, simply from a nutritional perspective. So we're getting those nutrients into the system, into the systemic circulation by bypassing the gut. But more important, the concentrations at which we can get in the serum are such that it's much easier to, if you remember this concept of diffusion, it's much easier to push whatever those nutrients into the cell because of the diffusion gradient, concentration gradients.
Yeah, outstanding. I'd love to go deeper on the physiology, but I'll spare the audience on that. What's the evidence behind it? You just laid out some of the underlying mechanisms, but I'm curious what the actual evidence base shows around nutrient IV therapy.
Yeah.
It seems like it's an emerging area, so we might be early in some of the evidence, but admittedly not something that I'm looking at in journals. So, from your perspective, what do you see?
So there's not, and when we think about our big journals that are out there, the New England Journal of Medicine, for example, I'll just use that because that's people have heard of the New England Journal of Medicine. You're not going to find a lot of published trials on IV nutrient therapy in big journals like that, but there is quite a bit of data on IV nutrient therapy. And what I'd like to, I mean, I'll tell you where my source is. I mean, there's one main source, and I'm giving this guy some big pub right now because he really has helped me with my education. There's a guy out in Seattle, Washington named Dr. Paul Anderson. And he's a naturopath that's worked with the NIH, and he did lots and lots of studies with the NIH with IV nutrient therapy with things like vitamin C and some of the other vitamins. And a lot of his work is he has a fantastic, if any of you guys are interested in learning more about IV therapy, he has a website called Consult Dr. Anderson. And honestly, I use it at least 4 or 5 times a week for my education, and there's lots of educational material there, videos that really describe IV nutrient therapy. He does a lot of cancer work, but the concept of IV nutrient therapy he deals with beautifully with that education on that website. He also has a book. I actually have this book too, and it's called The Scientific Reference for Intravenous Nutrition Therapy. So if you want to know the evidence, here it is. Okay. So there is a lot of evidence, particularly around things like vitamin C. I mean, vitamin C probably has the most evidence of all of the nutrients that we use.
And that's great. And we'll link up to that on the show notes page so everyone has a chance to check that out. I know we're only going to be able to go so deep into this discussion today, so we'll definitely link up to that as a source, both the website and the book. So I guess as you're kind of going down this conversation, let's talk about some of the potential benefits and side effects of this, right? So, I mean, there's kind of some extend the benefits you talked about a little bit earlier, but then also talk about, with anything, there's good things that provide you. There's also potential downside. So can we look at both sides of the coin?
Absolutely, absolutely. Where do you want to start first? We want to start with benefits.
I'm a fan of starting with the positive over the negative. So
Okay,
let's
all
start
right.
with the benefits.
So let's start with the benefits. I mean, obviously, I think it depends on which of the micronutrients you're talking about, right? So I'll tell you some of the basic the most basic vitamins that a lot of people are deficient in are the B vitamins. And I think that if anybody's keeping up in the literature these days, or even on social media these days, you'll see a lot about methylation and B vitamins and understanding your genetics of this MTHFR, which is a gene that is important in methylation. There are a whole lot of other genes that are important in the whole methylation process, but suffice it to say that B vitamins are very important in this process called methylation. And methylation is a process by which we break down hormones, we metabolize neurotransmitters, we detoxify by methylation pathways. When there is any type of insult to our DNA, methylation is a process by which we heal DNA, thus, lowering the risk of cancers because of some type of DNA damage by going through methylation processes. People who don't methylate well have higher incidences of neurocognitive diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and heart disease. So giving B vitamins, and I never thought in a million years, I mean, me taking this jump into this space, not in a million years would I've realized that B vitamins were so important, right? And so they really are. And so that makes up the crux of a lot of our IV nutrient therapy, our B vitamins. When we think about some of the, so they can be used for all of those things, all of those conditions that I just said. And it's not to say that they cure those things, but I'm just saying how methylation is an important role in all of those conditions. Other things, energy. A lot of people use IVs just to get energy. Like, what does energy mean? Obviously, I think that your audience knows that, our currency of energy is ATP, which we know that we need important and normal mitochondrial function to do that. Well, the mitochondria require lots of cofactors in order to function appropriately, i.e., some of the amino acids. Carnitine is an important part. Coenzyme Q10 is an important part. There are lots of important molecules. And when we talk about maintaining oxidative stress balance, redox balance, a lot of these cofactors are important again, things like manganese and zinc, and all of these things can be given intravenously as well to improve mitochondrial function, which then improves our ATP production, which then improves our energy, right? So that's just kind of one way to think about it. NAD, same thing. NAD improves or increases mitochondrial biogenesis. So that's just the energy is one of those things. Things like migraine headaches. A lot of migraine headaches are really responsive to mineral magnesium. Magnesium deficiency is rampant. Okay, so simply giving things like magnesium in our IVs are super important. Vitamin C, I told you that's probably the most important one of them of all the nutrients that we use. We talk about vitamin C with respect to balancing the immune system. We talk about vitamin C with respect to its depending on the level of vitamin C and how much you're giving, it can be an antioxidant or it can be an oxidant. So very high dose vitamin C can be used for, I mean, Dr. Anderson that I mentioned uses a lot of high dose vitamin C to treat cancer patients. And there's a lot of data coming out in conjunction with chemotherapy drugs. The vitamin C high doses is very helpful in conjunction with the chemotherapeutic drugs. At the lower levels of vitamin C, they're very important antioxidants and really important in recycling some of our other antioxidants like glutathione. So, I mean, honestly, there's so many. I mean, I deal with a lot of people with fatiguing illnesses, chronic fatigue illnesses like mold and Lyme, and using glutathione and vitamin C in those patients. I mean, really, it changes the game and helping them feel better.
Great. Yeah. And I love some of the science we're getting into here. I feel like there's going to be some people listening to this podcast that might be flipping through their old physiology books to get reacquainted with things. Before we get into maybe the potential downsides or side effects, I think another way to frame this up, so we just framed it up from a condition perspective.
Hmm.
I think another way to frame it up is from a symptom perspective. And I'm gonna have a follow-up question for you in terms of like how to actually recommend this intervention in a second. But from a symptom standpoint, when somebody comes to you and they're presenting XYZ symptom, then the bell goes on, oh, this is someone that this might be appropriate for. Maybe you can provide that side of it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think we kind of touched on it just, I mean, a little bit ago. One of the more common things we see people just come in with fatigue. They're just tired. I mean, I'm extremely tired. So again, if you just think about it, again, not to get too much into the science, when people are telling me that they're tired, that tells me, okay, there probably is a mitochondrial problem somewhere. So I'm immediately thinking, okay, what can we do from a nutrient therapy perspective? What are the common things that are going wrong and that don't allow people, I mean, that will make you tired? And so that's when people come, I'm thinking that when they come in with those type symptoms, if there are symptoms like, obviously if they come in with any type of respiratory symptom, right? Respiratory, like yesterday, I had one of my patients come in. They're going to Europe in a couple of days, and he's coming out with this cold. He's sniffling, he's coughing.
Mhm.
That is, I don't think I've seen anything that works better than the vitamin C. When we talk about improving the immune system, he came in a couple of days ago, and the very next day he came back and he's like, "Oh my God, it's amazing! I can't believe this." And I looked at him, I was like, "Told you, I don't really make this stuff up." And then we gave him another one today, and then leaving for Europe, and he feels like a million times better. So the immune system component of it with the vitamin C, hands down, when people have respiratory type symptoms, the vitamin C is a no-brainer. Um, Migraines we talked about. I think again the headache part of it. I mean, a lot of those we touched on. Those are the common things that I see people
Mhm.
come in. Now we do a lot more specific IVs as well, depending on what their conditions are. And I don't want to get too much into the science of that. Maybe, I mean, one of the things I'm not going to talk about a lot right now that is, I mean, really incredibly powerful is using phospholipids, phosphatidylcholine IV in today's world of chronic illnesses and all of the exposures we have to toxins that are causing cell membrane issues, the
Mhm.
phosphatidylcholine is an amazing tool if you know how to use it correctly. But it's not just an amazing tool for the people who are super sick, for those overachievers, for the people who are the athletes and the people who are trying to understand how to improve overall cellular health. And I honestly don't think it's been utilized as much as it should be utilized in that group. We use it a lot for the sicker people, but for
Mhm.
the people who actually are looking to, the triathletes who are looking to improve their VO2 max, well, then we might use NAD, but I'll tell you, just looking at the science of and cell membrane and how the cell membrane affects mitochondrial health, phosphatidylcholine is probably even more important.
Fascinating. So this gets to my next question because some of these are kind of common everyday symptoms that people suffer from. I'm tired, I'm fatigued. You're using this in the context of a medical practice. People are coming to you. You're a trained physician. A lot of the professionals listening to this podcast, they're exercise physiologists, they're personal trainers, they're fitness professionals. I'm curious from your perspective how you would recommend that somebody in our audience talks to their client about this, because we also have to be cautious of scope of practice issues. We're not
Mhm.
diagnosing anything obviously on our end. So it's a delicate situation because we want to be cautious. So how would you recommend a non medical professional go about broaching the topic of potentially one of their clients utilizing nutrient IV therapy?
Honestly, to tell you what I would do, what I would recommend doing, and it's the value of this is it's worth its weight in gold, is have them get a micronutrient panel. Start talking about the fact that, what I talked about earlier about our food these days is lacking most of the nutrition or nutrients that we used to have. I try to be objective about everything that I do. And can do people actually, a lot of these, including Liquivida, a lot of people come in and it just gets IVs, right? Well, I like to be very objective about what I do. And so I get micronutrient testing, which is looking at amino acids, the minerals, your vitamins, on every single patient, because then I can show you where some of the issues are, and we can recommend oral supplements. We can recommend, food changes that are going to have more of the specific nutrient that you're missing. But we also recommend IV therapy based on the micronutrient panel. So with the space that you're in, it when we talk about optimizing health, I mean, it's worth every single person doing it, the micronutrient panel at least once a year, just to kind of see what we're dealing with. Because if there's a specific micronutrient you're missing, for example, if you're missing B2, I mean, I don't have to, maybe I just go out and I replete the B2, or I change my diet such that I'm getting more of the B2 riboflavin in, as opposed to kind of just randomly doing a bunch of stuff. Okay. At the other end of the spectrum, those same tests gives us ideas about oxidative stress levels. We can measure. There's a marker called 8-OHDG, 8-hydroxydeguanosine. That's a measure of oxidative stress. If I've got a oxidative stress, first, I got to figure out what's causing it. And second, those are the people that we can use more antioxidants like the vitamin C and glutathione and alpha lipoic acid, all of which be given IV, right? So it gives me a picture of what's going on. So now you're making recommendations based on an educated, what's going on with this client. So that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, and it sounds like, given that recommendation, it might make sense to, partner with a functional medicine physician in your community, somebody in, the nutritional realm, a registered
Mhm.
dietitian that understands, these kind of things, just to help navigate that. Most fitness professionals won't have access to, the kind of panel you're suggesting. So would you recommend that as a, possible partnership to facilitate something like this?
I think, yeah, I would do that. And believe it or not, though, there are some of these tests out there that you don't necessarily have to have. Um, uh, there are ways that a fitness professional could have access to tests like this. And as long as you're not taking insurance, how you're paid, there are ways that you can have access to some of these tests. I've been speaking with a couple of companies who do that. I won't name any names right now, but and if you want to know afterwards, we can kind of talk about that. But there are ways you could have access to tests.
I'd like to take a quick break from today's episode to tell you a little something about one of our sponsors. As all of you are well aware, addressing the wellness paradox is a lifelong passion project for me. And when you're going to go on a long journey, it's difficult to go it alone. You need to find like-minded individuals that are willing to go on that crusade with you. And that's exactly what I found at the MRF Institute. The team over at the MRF Institute creates educational content for fitness and wellness professionals who are serious about becoming a part of our healthcare continuum. Getting on the healthcare continuum is all about leveling up our skills to be looked at as that valued resource provider. The wellness paradox is certainly an avenue for you to do that, but we need many different levers to pull if we're going to get there. And the MRF Institute is definitely one of those levers. You can go to their website, mrfinstitute.org, to find all kinds of great, informative, free informational content. And if you choose to engage with any of their paid content, they've created a coupon code specifically for Wellness Paradox listeners. You can enter in WP 2022, that's WP, and then the number 2022 to the website at checkout to receive a 15% discount on your purchase. I highly recommend you go check out mrfinstitute.org. Now back to today's episode. Fascinating. So let's get into side effects and kind of red flags. And so let's start with side effects, and then we can move on to red flags where it wouldn't be appropriate for an exercise professional to say, hey, just go down this route. So, but let's talk about side effects first with these.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things nutrient therapy is done safely. The owner, president of Liquivida, Sam, and a group of other business people in this industry have come together to form the IV nutrient. I think it's the American IV Association to really get a better grasp and developing guidelines on what IV nutrient therapy business is best practices. Because what we know the benefits of IV nutrient therapy, but we also know that there are some people that's like the wild west
Mm-hmm.
with IV nutrient therapy, and we don't want the bad actors to shut down a very important and helpful space that's helping a lot of people right now. And so, what type of things can happen? I mean, all kinds of bad things can happen, right? I mean, even there's a risk of death if something's done the wrong way. All right. And so mixing things together, when we're talking about giving IVs, you can't just go in and just start mixing nutrients together, right? It's not that simple. There are several things that are very important. There are the pH of the solution, the osmolarity of the solution. And osmolarity means the concentrations of each of those substances, each of those minerals or vitamins in there. Our body, our blood has an osmolarity somewhere in the order of 280, 290, 300 milliosms. And so we need to be infusing substances that we want to be careful not to infuse substances that are hypoosmolar, because they
Mm-hmm.
can cause some issues with brain swelling and what comes as a result of that. So understanding what you are putting in the bag and how each of those interact. Sometimes when we mix the wrong things together, the substances can precipitate out. And so there definitely needs to be an education and someone who actually is educated and know what they're doing with respect to the IVs. I think a lot of companies, including Liquivida, we come up with these kits that you can, and anybody who buys the kits to distribute to give to their patients, you only put what's in the kit in the bag so that there's no chance for you to give the wrong things. Now, where the problem becomes if people start to say, I'm going to put something else in the bag that's not in this kit. And I mean, obviously they're instructed, if they are Liquivida partners, not to do that.
Right.
But certainly that's one of the risks involved. I mean, the osmolarity issue is a big one. Knowing what can be mixed, which substances can be mixed together is another one. Then we always have things like, okay, we're putting an IV in a patient's, in a client's arm, right? There's a risk of infection. There's a risk of bleeding. That's always, anytime a needle is involved, there's a risk of bleeding. There's a risk of infection. There's a risk of damage to the vein. Again, hopefully you're working with somebody who experienced in inserting the vein. I mean, the catheters to do the IVs. You have to be careful in knowing the patient's or the client's underlying medical history. If you're giving high doses of certain vitamins like vitamin C, there's certain things you need to know. There's something called G6PD deficiency. And if you have this G6PD deficiency, you don't want to give high dose vitamin C because you could cause some hemolysis or basically a rupture of these red blood cells. People who have renal issues, kidney issues, you really want to know if people have kidney issues, you really need to understand, okay, which nutrients I'm giving. Could we cause more issues with the kidneys, more damage to the kidneys? People with heart failure. Anybody with heart failure, obviously the first thing you want to be careful of, you don't want to be giving them lots of fluid in general, right? If they don't have good fluid balance and they're fluid overloaded. And more importantly, you don't want to give them these hypertonic solutions with a lot of saline either, because that's going to cause more fluid retention and potentially worsen their overall heart failure symptoms. So you really have to know your client when you're prescribing these IVs.
And that leads me to the question of if an exercise professional is out there and they think that this is something that would be appropriate for their patient or client, do you have any suggestion as to how they would possibly pick a organization that they would partner with for this? As I said at the top, I feel like there are all of these places that are just popping up all over the place right now that are offering this. I, it may be very early in the regulation, from an industry standpoint to even give this answer, but to the best extent you can, for the fitness professional who goes, I think my clients, might benefit from this. Could you provide a little bit of guidance as to maybe how they can discriminate between someone who's above board and not?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tough one, but I think one way to go about it is have them have a consult with a practitioner, whether it's a physician or a PA, about I mean, that client's entire history. And if they have a PA or a doctor there that can talk to you about it, I feel more assured. And you'd also, again, I think that sometimes what happens is knowing exactly what's going to be best for that client. You really don't know unless you really have that conversation with the client. We do have sometimes we have wellness coordinators that are trained to do that as well, to speak with the client. What I would say, have somebody, the business should have somebody there that can answer your questions, ask you what you're looking for and why you're here, not you just walk in and say, hey, I want to get X off the shelf and just pick something. I mean, having somebody that can help give you some guidance as to ask you what's going on with you and then tell you why they recommend what they recommend. That's one way I would look at doing it. Not just walking in and say, hey, I'd like to have the super energy booster, whatever it is, number 3. And that's what they do, because that is a red flag to me. If I can just go in and say, give me that, that's a problem.
Yeah, we're not talking about going to tropical smoothie and getting your
Right.
your post workout drink here. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's helpful. And I think for the exercise professionals that are listening to this, I think it is doing your homework. Knowing who those good community partners are. I know a lot of people that listen to our podcast who really do partner as part of multidisciplinary teams, if it's in their own
Mhm.
organization or across multiple organizations. So I think that applies. And from what it sounds like you said. The areas you really have to be cautious here are when people do have, chronic underlying conditions. Just as we would be cautious from an exercise perspective with those individuals, same thing would exist with this.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So, what's the take home message on this? We talked about a lot. This was a complicated conversation at a couple points in time, which I greatly enjoy when we can get into the weeds. But what's
Right.
the take home message for our fitness professional audience on nutrient IV therapy?
Yeah, I think that IV nutrient therapy is a great way. When you're talking about fitness professionals, I think it's a great, I would call it a great edge. It's a great way to boost the system with the nutrients that most of the time we are lacking. You're getting these higher concentrations that you can't get with the oral intake. I think that as society gets more and more advanced, and again, we can maybe talk about this later, and this is just coming from my experience with environmental toxin testing, some of the stuff that I do. Part of the thing that makes us get old and sick are the toxins that we're exposed to. I'll say it again. And I think a lot of what IV nutrient therapy offers with the vitamin C and glutathione and some of the phospholipids is a way to deal with that. So as we talk about optimizing performance, and I promise you we'll hear more about this as we start to kind of, a lot of stuff, if we were to look at the things I'm talking about and a lot of stuff that I'm going to be talking about in the future, we will see I want to bring the attention to kind of why people are getting sick and old, because we need to see it, right? And once you start to see these things, when we start to talk about optimizing performance and longevity, there's a big piece of this we're missing. There's all kinds of things like the NAD and all these other peptides and facetin and other things that are out there. But at the root of the problem and what's causing the issues with the mitochondria are the things that we're exposed to. So dealing with those is going to be key. And the
Great.
IV therapy is a great way to do that.
Great. So, part of this is, this is a good edge right now, but the other side of this is stay tuned because it sounds like there's a lot of good information that's going to be coming down the pipe in years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Where can people go if they want to find out more about Liquivida?
Actually, just liquivida.com. Liquivida.com is our website. Our flagship store was out of Fort Lauderdale. We have stores all over the country now. We have doctors that are using the Liquivida products. Like I said, we sell our IV kits, and I think we have close to 5,000 doctors across the country using it now. We are focusing right now on educating our network of physicians as well. One of the things that I talked about with the environmental toxins and things, we're going to be educating all of our network about kind of how we evaluate our patients and really kind of give them, when we talk about optimal wellness and kind of giving people edges, really want to educate our network about that so that they can start to kind of employ some of these strategies as well.
Great, great. We'll link up to that on the show notes page. Dr. Davis, this has been great. Very educational conversation for me and I think our audience. Before I let you go, I'm going to end the podcast with the question I always end the podcast on. And this is one of my favorite questions to ask to medical professionals. And I consider the wellness paradox to be the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and the medical community. From your perspective as a physician, if you could give the fitness professionals that are listening one piece of advice to close off that gap and have better relationships with physicians like yourself, what would that one piece of advice be?
I can tell all my patients about their micronutrients and things we just talked about, but I need the type of exercises, particularly in that age bracket of 50 to older, and you were not trying to, go herniate a disc like I did when I turned 50. I thought it was a couple years ago. I thought I was Hercules.
Mm,
I realized that, okay, I don't need to be deadlifting 550 pounds. I mean, why am I doing this right now?
yeah,
So having somebody somebody, that's a great way to interact. And I think how you interact with me is going to be different from other physicians
sure.
because I have an interest in the space, right? But maybe being able to talk to physicians about specifics about exercise prescriptions and how they can help how these prescriptions help their patients, giving them some data on that. I don't think enough people do VO2 max testing, and it doesn't have to be done by the physician. I mean, the technology out there so that the fitness professionals can do that. So what I would do is harness that data that's out there and show how they can help your patients by utilizing this data. Yeah,
Dr. Christopher Davis, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
yeah, absolutely. It was great to be here, Michael. Good to meet you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Davis as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a big difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found in the show notes page. It's by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 115. Please be on the lookout for our next episode when it drops in 2 weeks. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next, please be well